I never thought that my own son's birthday gift to me would be a bottle smashed over my head and a scream wishing that I rot alive. Before continuing, subscribe and turn on the notification bell because we share new stories every day. Give it a like and tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. My name is Antonio Gálvez. I am 61 years old, and if I dare to tell this story today, it is not out of morbid curiosity or resentment, but because I learned in the hardest way that the cruelest betrayals do not come from strangers, but from those we share blood with and vowed to protect. What happened that afternoon in Granada completely changed the way I understand family, love, and even my own dignity. It was September 12th, 2021. I had organized a simple dinner, nothing extravagant, with a few close friends and family members to celebrate another year of life. I had reserved about 70 seats in a discreet venue on the outskirts of the city, although fewer people ended up attending, around 50 guests, including familiar faces and a few neighbors. I felt calm and content. After the pandemic, reconnecting with others felt especially meaningful. We were toasting with local wine when my son Marcos walked into the room. From the very first moment, I could tell something was wrong. He was not the cheerful son who should have been there to congratulate his father. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes were red, and there was a clear mix of alcohol and anger about him. He moved with a tension that everyone could feel. As we approached each other to greet, instead of giving me the usual kiss on the cheek, he grabbed my arm tightly and whispered in a low voice, "Just for me. Today you give me 400,000 euros, or this will end badly." I tried to stay calm and asked him to respect the moment, that it was neither the time nor the place, but he did not accept my refusal. Without hesitation, he grabbed one of the wine bottles from the table and in front of the guests who were still celebrating, smashed it against another glass and then against my forehead. The room fell silent. I felt the glass split the skin above my eyebrow, and the warm blood begin to run down my face. Then I heard something I will never forget. "You should rot, you miserable old man." Some guests tried to come closer, others stepped back in shock. My daughter Clara, a geriatric doctor, immediately rushed to help me, but I stopped her and, with a forced smile and blood still running down my face, I tried to downplay it. "Don't worry. This is also a gift," I said, hoping to prevent a bigger scene. I took a deep breath. That moment of self-control was what kept me from reacting with violence or throwing words back at him in front of everyone. If I had lost my composure, he would have succeeded in humiliating me completely. So I chose silence. The restrained laughter of some neighbors and the clear discomfort on familiar faces began to fade before my eyes, as Clara quietly guided me into a separate room. With trembling yet careful hands, she cleaned my wound, almost in tears, repeating, "Dad, you have to report him. This isn't normal. It's not just a momentary outburst." I nodded in agreement, but deep down I knew it wasn't just a burst of anger. It was part of something deeper, a chain of accumulated disrespect over time. That night, as the place emptied and the guests quietly left, I made an important decision. I wouldn't act on impulse or report him immediately, but I also wouldn't ignore what had happened like I had before. I needed to observe, understand, and wait for the truth to reveal itself. If my own son was capable of attacking me like that and wishing me harm. The physical wound wasn't the most serious part. The real danger was what was unfolding within my family and around my assets. With my forehead bandaged and the echo of silence still lingering, I realized that what was coming would be worse than that attack. I stopped seeing Marcos as a son I could trust and began to see him as an adversary. It was only the beginning of a battle that would change my life. When I closed the door to that room and the murmur of the guests faded away, I felt an overwhelming weight fall over me. Clara insisted on taking me to the hospital to stitch the wound, but I refused. I only asked for gauze and some ice. I didn't want to end up at a police station that same night or become headline news the next day. I chose to endure the pain and remain calm, observing instead of reacting. Standing in front of the mirror with an improvised bandage, I realized something crucial. Calmness could be more powerful than any impulsive reaction. In the days that followed, the wound began to heal, but the tension in the air remained raw. Some friends called me with short, awkward phrases, unsure whether to show support or pretend nothing had happened. Most chose silence. Only Clara remained steady, with a quiet, almost defiant clarity. Used to high-pressure situations, she insisted that what Marcos did was neither an accident nor a simple outburst. "Dad, this is a sign that something worse is coming," she said with firm conviction. I listened, though inside I struggled. For years I had tolerated demands, small acts of disrespect, and unpaid debts. Back in 2017, I had even noticed my signature forged on a document. But I chose to ignore it to avoid conflict within the family. I believed time and affection would correct what was wrong, but that blow with the bottle forced me to confront the harsh reality of my mistake. Forgiveness without limits is not a virtue. It is fuel for the one who harms. Meanwhile, Marcos showed no remorse. Not a call, not a message, just a silence that hurt more than the blow itself. A week after the party, I found him at the entrance of my building. He was leaning against the wall, unkempt, phone in hand, smoking nervously. As I approached, he spoke bluntly. "Have you thought about what I told you? You can't keep holding on to everything while I drown in debt." I didn't respond. I simply looked at him. He resembled less and less the boy I used to take to school with his backpack and his sandwich wrapped in foil. The man in front of me was different, cold, hardened, more inclined to destroy than to build. I closed the door without a word. That was my first silent victory. Not giving in to his provocation, not handing him control over my reaction. The nights grew heavy. I would wake up remembering his shout, the blood running down my forehead. I walked through the house in silence, replaying our last conversations. Everything carried the same dark tone. Urgent requests for money, unexplained trips, vague promises that things would improve next month. I had believed I was helping him, but in reality, I had been paving the way for a far more dangerous ambition. One Sunday, Clara came over for breakfast. The smell of fresh coffee and toast contrasted with the seriousness on her face. She sat across from me and, lowering her voice, revealed something that chilled me. "I heard Marcos and Isabel talking in the kitchen. They didn't know I was there. They're planning to declare you mentally unfit, Dad. And Sergio Munoz, that lawyer who's always around Marcos, has already offered to arrange everything so they can take your assets." The cup trembled in my hands. The coffee tasted bitter as a knot tightened in my throat. The bottle attack had only been the surface. What truly mattered was that cold, calculated plan to strip me of everything I had built over a lifetime. In that moment, I understood the true scale of it. It wasn't just greed. It was erasure, removing me legally, leaving me without control over my own assets, turning me into a shadow. I looked at Clara and saw in her eyes a mix of strength and restrained anger. She was 29, yet in that moment she seemed stronger than me, holding me together as my world collapsed. I took a deep breath and silently swore I would not allow it. But my response would not be violence or shouting. It would be intelligence, patience, and strategy. In the weeks that followed, I completely changed the way I behaved. In public, I kept up an appearance of normality, but in private, I began putting everything in order. Documents, deeds, contracts. Every paper I reviewed represented years of work and sacrifice. The beach house, the estate in Jaén, the apartment in Granada, everything was at risk if they achieved their goal. I spent long hours in my study, lit only by a desk lamp, carefully reconstructing every financial move of my life. I couldn't afford mistakes or leave loose ends that might allow their scheme to succeed. I also couldn't raise suspicion. Marcos was impulsive, but Isabel was far more calculating. Behind her sweet demeanor was a cold, strategic mind. The wound on my forehead slowly healed, but inside something else was growing. Not anger, but determination. In the silence of my home, I kept repeating to myself that they would not take away my dignity or everything I had built. And so, beneath the surface of my daily routine, I began preparing my next move. What Marcos and Isabel didn't realize was that I was no longer the vulnerable man from that night. They believed the incident had weakened me, that I would eventually give in. But in truth, something new had emerged within me. Quiet, firm, and dangerous. My greatest strength lay in that silence. Learning from Clara what they were planning felt like another blow, but this time not to my body, but to something much deeper. From that moment on, everything around me took on a different meaning. I began to reinterpret past memories and situations from a new perspective. I remembered, for instance, an incident in 2017. A rental contract appeared bearing my name and signature, even though I had never signed it. At the time, I dismissed it as a simple administrative error. Now I understood it had been a test, a way to see how far they could go without consequences. Many of Isabel's behaviors also began to make sense. Since joining the family, she had always appeared kind, helpful, attentive. Yet at the same time, she knew exactly what to say to influence my decisions. "Antonio, children must be supported no matter what," she would say whenever I hesitated to help Marcos financially. Back then, it sounded like advice. Now I recognized it as a strategy to weaken my judgment. Little by little, all those memories started to fit together like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. It was no coincidence that Marcos kept asking for larger sums of money, nor that Isabel always stepped in at just the right moment. Everything pointed to a carefully crafted plan, slowly built over time. Clara would watch me in silence whenever I became lost in my thoughts. Her concern was evident, but so was the respect with which she stood by me through it all. During a lunch, as I was cutting bread with steady hands, Clara spoke to me calmly. "Dad, we can't pretend nothing happened after what I heard." She then explained that Isabel spoke with a chilling coldness, claiming that I was no longer fit to manage my own life and that a manipulated psychiatric report would be enough to have me declared incompetent. Hearing that, I felt a mix of disgust and sadness. It wasn't just about money. It was an attempt to strip me of my clarity, my identity, to turn me into someone without a voice, reduced to a meaningless signature before a judge. At that moment, I fully realized how vulnerable I could become. On the outside, I was still a whole man, lucid, aware, and in control of my decisions. But I understood that with twisted statements and the help of a corrupt lawyer, they could render me legally irrelevant. And what hurt the most was that this threat came from my own family. That night, my mind went even further back. I saw myself in 1994, outside the school, picking up Marcos after he had fought with other kids. I defended him fiercely, lifted him off the ground, and took him home with pride. I couldn't reconcile that memory with the man who now seemed ready to destroy me. The confusion inside me was overwhelming, but little by little something became clear. I couldn't remain silent, but I also couldn't act recklessly. I needed support, evidence, and a solid plan. Clara was my first pillar, and she also told me about someone who could help us. Ramon Vasquez, a private investigator experienced in family disputes, whom she had met at the hospital. At first, I hesitated. I had always handled my problems on my own. But this time, it wasn't just my peace of mind at stake, but everything I had built for the future. In the end, I agreed. "Contact Ramon as soon as possible, but keep it discreet," I told her. Clara nodded without hesitation. The days that followed were filled with a tense calm. Marcos didn't return home, although I knew from others that he was still frequenting bars and nightclubs in Granada. Isabel, meanwhile, kept up appearances, sending polite messages as if nothing had happened. It was clear they wanted to keep me at ease while preparing their final move. As for me, I maintained my outward routine. I went to the market, greeted neighbors, even smiled. But inside, something different had already begun. I reviewed every safe, every document, every deed stored in my office. It wasn't just about legal protection. It was about preserving my history. Each property represented years of effort, sleepless nights, and sacrifice. I would not allow all of that to become nothing more than spoils taken by greed. When I met Ramon at the end of September 2021, the first thing that struck me was his simplicity. He wore a worn-out jacket and carried an old briefcase, far from the typical image of a movie detective. Yet his gaze reflected experience and a calmness similar to that of a surgeon before an operation. He shook my hand and got straight to the point. "Your daughter has already filled me in. You're in danger, Don Antonio. But this isn't something to rush. This won't be solved with a hasty report. It requires time and solid evidence." For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. I was no longer alone facing uncertainty. In addition to Clara, I now had someone from the outside willing to bring clarity to what had so far only been suspicions. That afternoon, as the light faded over Granada and the lights of the Albaycin began to glow in the distance, I made a firm decision. I would not allow disrespect to take over my life. The bottle attack had only been a warning. What lay ahead was a silent confrontation, a strategic game in which every move had to be calculated. I realized then that when betrayal comes from within the family, only intelligence and discretion can restore what they try to take from us. Ramon's presence felt like opening a window in a room that had been filled with stale air for too long. His way of thinking, calm, methodical, and without embellishment, commanded respect without effort. After that first meeting, I began revisiting memories I had long set aside, which now, under his practical perspective, took on a troubling meaning. There are things one chooses to soften with excuses. For years I told myself that Marcos was going through a rough patch, that Isabel only meant to help, that certain details weren't so important. But once the pieces start to fall into place, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. My mind went back to December 2017. I received a letter from a bank demanding payment for a personal loan that I had supposedly taken out. The amount wasn't large, but the emotional impact was. When I reviewed the case, I found my signature forged and a contact address that wasn't mine. Marcos denied everything, and Isabel, with unsettling calm, insisted it must be a mistake. To avoid conflict, I chose to pay the debt and move on. Today, I clearly understand that it was a test. The first attempt to see how far they could go without me reacting. And I also remembered how Isabel, during social gatherings, would slip in comments about my fatigue or my supposed lack of energy to manage my assets. She did it in a kind, almost protective tone. But the message was clear. Sooner or later I would lose control, and her husband would take my place. At the time I didn't see it that way, but now everything made sense. These were ideas planted little by little, preparing the ground to justify what they intended to do. As I went over all this, Ramon proposed a clear plan. Observe without raising suspicion, gather evidence quietly, and avoid any direct confrontation. Haste is your worst enemy, he told me. And I, who had always learned to move carefully, understood that this was the only way to win this game. Sometimes I'm struck by how vividly the sounds and smells of those days remain in my memory. The scent of old paper in my study as I sorted through documents, the click of the pen as I signed old deeds, the distant chimes of Granada's cathedral marking the hours while I tried to piece together my life among stacks of files. There were nights when sleep barely came. The image of the bottle striking my forehead returned again and again, like a relentless echo. Yet that wound also became a constant reminder that I had to leave behind the tolerance that had led me to that point. How many times had I excused serious wrongs as simple mistakes? How many of my silences had Marcos and Isabel turned into opportunities? Ramon, ever meticulous, asked me to review old emails, agendas, even printed WhatsApp conversations I had kept out of habit. And gradually he began to detect patterns. Requests for money at very specific moments, unexplained trips to Madrid that coincided with meetings at law firms, notary offices operating at unusual hours. His ability to connect the dots was remarkable. Clara watched him with admiration, while I felt a mix of relief and bitterness, as I realized the problem had been right in front of me for years, and I had refused to see it. I remember one day in particular, at the end of October 2021. Ramon arrived with his worn briefcase and showed me recordings obtained legally and discreetly. In a cafe in the city center, Isabel was speaking with Sergio Munoz. They discussed medical reports and the possibility of bribing a psychiatrist to declare me cognitively impaired. Hearing my name in that conversation, along with phrases like, "He's already old, he won't be able to resist much longer," sent a chill through me. It was no longer suspicion or interpretation. It was reality, raw and undeniable. Clara couldn't hold back her tears when she heard it. I held her, though I was trembling myself. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes toward her brother, not just concern. For both of us, any trace of trust had vanished. The bond of blood had been completely poisoned. After that moment, I understood that I had to protect my legacy. It wasn't just about money or property. It was about preserving my story, the work of a lifetime, and above all, protecting the only daughter who still stood by my side. In the days that followed, while Ramon continued gathering evidence, I also turned inward, revisiting my memories. I opened photo albums. Marcos as a child running along the beach, or Isabel smiling during the first Christmases we spent together. I felt a deep mix of nostalgia and anger as I realized that those happy images had, in a way, been the prelude to what was to come. In the privacy of my home, I kept reminding myself that I couldn't afford to fall into self-pity. If I let sadness take over, they would gain the upper hand. And strangely enough, that decision made me stronger. Like an old tree weathering storms without falling, I resolved to endure and strike at the right moment. I understood it with absolute clarity. I could no longer be the permissive father. I had to become strategic, not out of revenge, but out of dignity. I would not allow them to manipulate my story, my decisions, or my will. From that moment on, every memory stopped being just part of the past and became a tool against those who wanted to strip everything from me. Between memories and certainties, I made a firm decision. I was ready to face, calmly and with a clear mind, those who had tried to destroy me from within my own family. The day I decided to definitively close the door on my vulnerability began like any other. Strong coffee, silence in the kitchen, and Clara reviewing reports at the table. But inside, everything had changed. I knew it was no longer enough to reflect on the past or gather clues. It was time to act. Clara had proven an unwavering loyalty. She was not just my daughter or my doctor. She was my strongest ally in all of this. That morning, she insisted again, calmly, "Dad, none of this matters if you don't protect it legally. Ramon can investigate, but what will truly protect you is securing everything properly." I knew she was right. I had spent weeks reviewing figures, properties, and documents. The total was clear, nearly 3 million euros built over decades of effort. And beyond the money, that figure was the very reason behind Marcos and Isabel's greed. That same afternoon, I went to see Ramon. He listened carefully and suggested bringing in another ally, a trustworthy notary, far from Granada and outside the reach of Sergio Munoz. At first, I hesitated, fearing leaks, but Ramon reassured me. "I know someone in Cordoba. He's discreet and reliable. He can help you without raising suspicion." I agreed without overthinking it. Clara sighed with relief. And so, in secrecy, we defined our roles. She would look after my well-being. Ramon would gather evidence, and I would handle the legal protection of everything I owned. The following days passed under a facade of normality. I even ran into Isabel at the supermarket. We exchanged polite smiles while she mentioned that Marcos was traveling for business. I knew perfectly well that his reality was very different. Her demeanor was flawless on the surface, but hollow underneath. I nodded as if it meant nothing, while inside me a solid barrier was rising, one that could no longer be crossed. At the end of November 2021, we traveled to Cordoba under the pretense of a medical appointment, a strategy to avoid raising suspicion. There I met the notary, a serious man with a calm gaze, rectangular glasses, and hands that reflected the experience of having drafted countless wills. I laid everything out in detail. The assault, my doubts, the evidence Ramon had gathered, the attempt to have me declared incompetent. There was no need to exaggerate. The facts were already stark enough. He listened to me for over an hour in an office lined with books, and in the end, he spoke firmly. What you need is to establish an irrevocable trust. If it's done properly, neither your son nor your daughter-in-law will be able to touch your money, even if they try to declare you incompetent. The management will remain in Clara's hands, and in the future, your granddaughter will also be protected. I felt a deep sense of relief, as if a heavy burden had begun to lift from my shoulders. For too long, my assets had been a weakness. Now they could become a solid defense. The process was neither quick nor simple. For weeks, we reviewed properties, updated valuations, and organized documents. It was a meticulous, almost surgical task, but with each signature came a growing sense of peace. Meanwhile, Ramon continued gathering evidence, recordings, recovered documents, suspicious financial movements linked to Sergio Muñoz. Little by little, everything started to fall into place. Clara, for her part, managed to maintain an admirable balance. At breakfast, she would talk about her work, her patients, and medical conferences, trying to keep the tension from consuming me. And when she noticed me faltering, she would gently say, "Dad, you're not alone. They're not going to beat you." In January 2022, after completing all the legal procedures, the trust was officially registered. The notary shook my hand and said something I still remember. "From now on, your assets are protected. Only the law can intervene, and everything is in the hands of those you trust." That night I slept differently. For the first time in months, I rested without nightmares or sudden jolts. At dawn, I opened the window and breathed in the cold winter air. I knew I had taken a decisive step. I was no longer vulnerable. I had taken control. Still, the situation was far from over. While I was strengthening my position, Marcos and Isabel were intensifying their moves. I heard things. Meetings with doctors, frequent visits to Muñoz's office, conversations about properties that were still in my name. What they didn't know was that Ramon was documenting every one of those movements. As for me, I learned to remain calm, to listen without reacting, to pretend normality, to endure false gestures without revealing anything. It felt like being inside a play where everyone believed they controlled the script, unaware that the ending had already been written in my favor. In that January of 2022, I finally understood something with complete clarity. Sharing blood does not guarantee loyalty. True strength lies in recognizing betrayal and responding with intelligence. Clara represented the future, steady and loyal. Marcos, on the other hand, had chosen a darker path. Isabel walked beside him, like a shadow feeding that descent. And I, in silence, had already begun preparing the moment when the whole truth would come to light. The first months of 2022 turned into a kind of silent game, filled with hidden tension. I had the feeling that every move I made in public was being watched, as if Isabel and Marcos sensed that something was unfolding behind their backs. What they didn't know, however, was that I was no longer acting from a place of weakness. My legal position was secured, and now the goal was more complex, to gather solid evidence that would expose their plan. Ramon worked with almost obsessive precision. He would arrive at my office with his worn briefcase and, in a calm tone, update me on every development. The way he operated made it clear that nothing was being left to chance. We were building something carefully, step by step. He had managed to place recording devices in strategic locations, cafes where Isabel met with Muñoz, and the lawyer's own office, and even Marcos's car, all with the help of specialized contacts. Listening to him, I felt as though my life had shifted from a quiet routine into a full-scale investigation. One afternoon in February, Ramon played an audio recording for me. In it, Isabel's voice was clear, saying that the incapacity filing should be submitted in March, backed by purchased psychiatric reports, and that if it was done before Holy Week, no one would suspect anything. Those words hit me like a blow, as if they were deciding my fate behind closed doors. Clara, who was with me at the time, couldn't help but shudder. Her medical background made it clear how serious it was to falsify diagnoses. It wasn't just a personal attack, it was a major ethical violation. Her anger grew when Ramon produced printed emails obtained through internal leaks. In them, Munoz explained to Isabel how to transfer properties into third-party names so that, once I was declared incompetent, everything would fall under Marcos's control as legal guardian. That revelation was hard to process. This was no longer just the greed of a son. It was a carefully engineered scheme, with the lawyer providing the legal framework and my daughter-in-law supplying the cold strategic thinking. In this dynamic, Marcos seemed more like an impulsive figure driven by immediate financial need, while the real decisions were being orchestrated by Isabel and Munoz. For weeks, we focused on gathering every piece of that dark scheme. Ramon showed me restaurant receipts from meetings they had held, bank records with suspicious deposits linked to Munoz's firm, and even a cash payment receipt where Marcos's handwriting appeared unmistakably. All of it turned my stomach, but at the same time, it strengthened my conviction. This wasn't paranoia or the reaction of a wounded father. It was a real, documented structure that would eventually have to face justice. Meanwhile, I continued playing my role as a calm man, greeting neighbors, visiting my estate in Hyen, attending Sunday Mass. Marcos was convinced everything had been forgotten, and that my silence meant weakness. Isabel, always polite on the surface, sent me carefully crafted messages, suggestions about my rest or my future, as if she were acting out of concern. I replied briefly, pretending indifference, but by then, I understood that every word from her was part of the plan they were weaving against me. By March 2022, Ramon believed we had enough material to file a formal complaint, but he advised waiting a little longer. According to him, they still had time to destroy evidence if we acted too soon. It was better to secure every detail so that when the blow came, it would be final. I agreed, though the waiting became increasingly difficult. I slept poorly, and when I did manage to rest, the recordings echoed in my mind. I would wake up in the middle of the night, walking through the dark house, going over the strategy again and again so I wouldn't lose control. It was then that Ramon obtained what he called the key piece, a discreetly recorded video in an office where Munoz and Isabel discussed paying specialists to sign a false diagnosis about my mental condition. Hearing the lawyer speak coldly about amounts and deadlines erased any remaining doubt. When I saw those images, I understood with absolute clarity what was happening. It wasn't a misunderstanding or an exaggeration. They were planning to legally erase me as a person. That night I spoke with Clara for hours. I admitted how torn I felt. On one hand, the betrayal of my own son. On the other, the calm of having protected my assets in time. She responded firmly that this went beyond material things. It was about defending my dignity against those trying to erase me. Her words gave me strength. They made me realize that what truly mattered wasn't the money, but preserving my integrity and my ability to decide over my own life until the very end. Toward the end of that month, Ramon handed me a comprehensive report with dates, transcripts, and documentary evidence. We placed it in a simple folder, fully aware that it would soon be presented to the police and the courts. I, who had always tried to resolve family conflicts in private, realized that this was no longer a personal matter. It was a crime, plain and simple. That spring, as Granada began to bloom and the scent of orange blossoms filled the air, I felt it was time to move from defense to action. I was no longer the wounded man from that celebration, but someone ready to respond with the truth and the law on his side. The day I decided to turn all that evidence into legal action began with a sharp cold. I had spent weeks working with Ramon, organizing documents, listening to disturbing recordings, on reading emails that revealed betrayal in its rawest form. Even so, taking that step required something deeper, accepting that my son was not merely lost, but an active participant in a crime against me. As April 2022 arrived and the almond trees began to bloom, a firm determination took root within me. One afternoon, Clara, Ramon, and I traveled in silence to Cordoba. Not a word was spoken during the journey. The gray landscape mirrored my thoughts, drifting between memories of Marcos as a child and the harsh reality of who he had become. The notary received us with seriousness. He had already been informed of the situation. We placed everything we had gathered over months on his desk, transcribed audios, images, altered documents, and emails. He reviewed each piece carefully, taking notes. When he finished, he spoke gravely. "Mr. Gálvez, this is more than enough to initiate criminal proceedings, but before taking that step, we must ensure that your assets are fully protected." I nodded. That was precisely why I was there. Although the trust had already been established, there were still details to refine. We reviewed clauses and signed addendums to ensure that, even if anyone attempted to question my capacity, all decisions would be irrevocably placed in Clara's hands. Additionally, my granddaughter Inez was secured as a future beneficiary. In essence, we were sealing off any possibility of external interference, like locking a system whose key no one else could ever find. As I signed with a steady hand, I felt a sense of relief begin to rise within me. The fear of losing everything I had built over the years started to fade. I was no longer at the mercy of others. My work and legacy were now protected within a solid legal structure. As we left, Clara took my hand, a gesture we hadn't shared in a long time. In that simple contact, I felt calm and a quiet sense of pride. She understood that we weren't just protecting assets, but something deeper, our dignity. Ramon, meanwhile, remained composed, almost unreadable as always. Still, in his eyes, I could sense the satisfaction of someone who knows the plan is unfolding exactly as intended. Even so, the most delicate step remained, taking everything to justice. That was when Ramon made something clear to me. "Antonio, you must not file the complaint yourself. If you do, they could accuse you of manipulation. I'll handle it through discreet contacts. Your daughter will be listed as a secondary witness. That way, they'll never know when or how the process began." I agreed without hesitation. I had already understood that the key was to act without exposing myself. This was no time for public gestures, but for precise, silent moves until the very end. In the days that followed, I practiced patience. Whenever I crossed paths with Isabel, I remained polite. I even agreed to a meal where Marcos was present. He spoke arrogantly, boasted about supposed business deals, and claimed he would soon resolve his problems. I listened without reacting, as if watching a meaningless performance. Deep down, I knew the end was near. The night before the evidence was to be delivered, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my chair and replayed my life as if flipping through an invisible photo album. The youth of my wife, the childhood of my children, the sacrifices that built everything I was now defending. I thought about the pain of seeing my own son plotting against me, trying to erase me as a person. That wound ran deeper than any physical injury. Even so, I found strength in one essential truth. I was not alone. Clara, with her resolve and dedication, stood by me at every step. Ramon, with his sharp mind, had built a solid case. Even the notary had shown a commitment that went beyond mere professionalism. That small network of support was enough to hold me steady in the middle of that silent battle. On April 5th, 2022, Ramon submitted the final case file at the police station. It contained everything: audio recordings of Isabel negotiating bribes, the video in which Munoz set the price for falsified reports, emails where Marcos offered properties that still belonged to me, all supported by dates, signatures, and verified evidence. At the same time, Clara signed a brief statement confirming that she had overheard her brother and sister-in-law planning to have me declared incompetent. With that, the legal process was set in motion. We knew it wouldn't be immediate. A scheme like that doesn't collapse overnight. But we had already taken the crucial step, bringing it onto solid ground. For the first time in a long while, I felt I could breathe freely. I was no longer the vulnerable man cornered by his own son, but someone who had turned pain into strategy. That afternoon, as I returned home, I watched the sunset over the Alhambra and allowed myself a faint smile. I knew the hardest part was still ahead, but I also knew that every step I had taken was firm. The legal battle had begun, and I was ready to see it through to the end. The days that followed carried a deceptive calm. Everything seemed normal on the surface, yet beneath it, something significant was unfolding within the institutions. I continued my routine, walking through the neighborhood, visiting my estate, exchanging casual conversations with neighbors who had no idea what was happening. But inside me, something had changed forever. Confirmation that things were moving forward came soon after. One morning, Ramon showed up at my house with a restrained but telling expression. Without hesitation, he said, "They've started intercepting calls. Munoz and his circle don't know it yet, but everything they say from now on will be recorded." A chill ran through me. The net was tightening. I thought of Marcos, unaware, confident, perhaps speaking carelessly, not realizing that every word could be used against him. At the same time, Isabel began to show signs of unease. I noticed it during a chance encounter on Gran Via. She seemed tense, constantly glancing around as if sensing something was off. She tried to speak to me in her usual polite tone, but her voice betrayed her nerves. "Your son worries a lot about you, Antonio. You should think about taking it easy," she said. In another context, those words might have sounded kind, but in that moment, knowing everything behind them, they felt hollow, almost unsettling. Clara kept insisting that I remain cautious at all times. "Don't show anything, Dad. Let them think they're still in control," she would repeat. I followed her advice to the letter. In public, I stayed composed, even during family gatherings where Marcos would show up again without speaking to me. He communicated more through arrogant gestures and superior glances than with words. He believed that silence placed him above everything, unaware that he was completely ignorant of what was already unfolding. By the end of April, the first clear sign appeared. Sergio Munoz's office was raided. Ramon was the first to confirm it. An internal source had told him that officers left the place carrying boxes full of documents, seized computers, and incriminating material. Even though I didn't witness it, I could picture the scene vividly. The lawyer pretending to be surprised while his world collapsed into confiscated folders. The news spread quietly at first, but it inevitably reached Isabel and Marcos. That same week, Marcos called me. His tone had changed. There was anxiety in his voice. "Dad, we need to talk. Things are getting complicated." I listened without reacting and replied coldly, "Whenever you want." There were no reproaches or warmth, just a measured distance. After hanging up, I remained staring at the phone in silence. His attempt to reach out was nothing more than a sign that he was beginning to sense the trouble closing in. Isabel reacted differently. Instead of seeking conversation, she withdrew. She stopped attending family gatherings, left messages unanswered, and some neighbors mentioned seeing her anxious. "I'm moving between ATMs and offices." Ramon suspected she was trying to move money before everything collapsed. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to progress. Clara, with her professional composure, explained each step to me. Legal documents, expert reports, possible summons. I listened gratefully, because she was able to bring clarity to a process that felt confusing to me. Her steadiness supported me more than I had expected. And in the middle of it all, I understood something important. Beyond the pain, I was also witnessing the strengthening of a genuine bond between father and daughter. In May, We received confirmation that the trust had been fully validated in the official records. That news felt like a definitive shield. Even if they attempted any maneuver, nothing could be moved without Clara's authorization. I felt a sense of calm that sharply contrasted with everything we had been going through. Even so, Marcos didn't give up. One afternoon, he showed up at the entrance of my building, looking worn down, his gaze avoiding mine, a cigarette trembling between his fingers. "Dad, you have to help me. You don't understand. There are dangerous people behind all this," he muttered, unable to meet my eyes. I watched him in silence, remembering the boy he once was. I didn't respond. I knew any words would be useless. He was already trapped in the consequences of his own choices. Eventually, he left, and leaving behind a trail of smoke and desperation. That night, I understood something important. The legal process was no longer just my defense. It was also the mirror in which my son would have to face what he had become. Isabel continued to operate from the shadows, and Munoz believed he could manipulate the law. But the truth was different. They were all surrounded. From within my apparent silence, I knew the outcome was drawing near. When justice finally began to act, there would be no need to raise my voice or seek revenge. It would be enough to stand firm with the calm of someone who had turned betrayal into a form of victory. The family confrontation came without me seeking it. It was in mid-May 2022, at my brother's house in the Vega of Granada. It was supposed to be a simple Sunday lunch, meant to ease tensions, but from the very beginning I knew things would eventually explode. I arrived with Clara, without expectations but fully prepared. The atmosphere was heavy from the start. My brothers, Antonio and Miguel, looked serious, aware that something grave was unfolding. Marcos sat in a corner, defeated, his eyes hollow. Isabel didn't show up, which no longer surprised anyone. Clara greeted everyone calmly, her composure standing in stark contrast to the tension in the room. It only took a few minutes before Marcos broke the silence. He slammed his fist on the table, spilling some wine, and with a shaken, almost hysterical voice shouted, "Dad, enough already! You're ruining my life!" I looked at him without answering right away. I let silence speak first, a barrier against his dramatics. He continued, more agitated. "What are you trying to do? I see me destroyed. I'm your son. How can you allow them to investigate me, to go after me, to humiliate me like this?" His words pierced me, but not as they once had. This time, there was no fear, no guilt, only a cold, absolute clarity. I took a deep breath and, with steady calm, said to him, "Marcos, I'm not the one ruining your life. You did that yourself. With your lies, your debts, and your forgeries, I simply stopped covering for you like I used to." My words landed harder than any blow. My brothers avoided looking at me, unable to bear the tension in the room. Clara remained firm by my side. He tried to interrupt me, but I stopped him with a gesture and continued. "For years, I believed that blood ties justified silence and forgiveness. I thought that one day you would come to your senses and understand that I was never your enemy. But I was wrong. All I did was feed your ambition. And that night, when you hit me and wished me the worst, I finally understood where all this was coming from." His expression shifted, caught between anger and shame. I pressed on. "Now I know that you, Isabel, and Munoz were planning to have me declared incompetent to take everything from me. But I got there first. Everything is protected. That plan is over." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the smallest sounds in the room became noticeable. Marcos looked at me in disbelief, unable to react. What are you saying?" he murmured. I held his gaze. "I'm saying everything is documented. Conversations, emails, deals, all in the hands of the justice system, and soon it won't be you trying to take anything from me. It will be the law holding you accountable." His face changed in an instant. Anger gave way to fear. It was clear he was beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. Suddenly, he stood up, knocking over his chair, and shouted, "You're condemning me! You're sending me to prison!" Clara stepped in with surprising calm. "No, Marcos. You chose that path the moment you decided to betray Dad." He lowered his head. For a brief moment, he seemed fragile, almost like the boy he once was. But that image was gone. I stepped closer and, without raising my voice, concluded, "I have nothing left to give you. Love cannot exist without respect. From now on, you are responsible for everything you've done and for its consequences." After that, no one spoke. Marcos walked out without looking back, leaving a heavy silence behind him. My brother sighed, aware that something had been broken forever. Clara took my hand, and with that simple gesture, she brought me back a sense of calm. As night fell and I returned home, I was overcome by a painful and hard-to-explain feeling. It was not the fear that had once paralyzed me, but something closer to grief. I realized that, in a way, I had lost a son while he was still alive. Not because he had died, but because of the disloyal choices he had made, beyond redemption. In the midst of that morning, I also understood that the confrontation had been inevitable. Only in that way could the truth come to light before those close to us. And only in that way could I draw, with my own voice, the final line between the one who suffers and the one who harms. There was no longer room for naive reconciliation. All that remained was to trust that justice would move forward without hesitation, with the certainty that my former silence had turned into resistance, and May became a time of constant unease. After the altercation at my siblings' house, silence took on a strange role, almost like an accomplice. I knew the authorities' final move would not take long, though I did not know when or how it would come. I lived each morning as if it were the prelude to an imminent storm. The answer finally arrived on May 18th, 2022. Shortly after 8, Ramon burst into my house in a hurry, though still carrying his usual composure. He informed me that the police had carried out several simultaneous searches in Granada, at Muñoz's office, at a property belonging to Isabel, and at the apartment where Marcos spent most of his nights. I stood frozen, unable to react immediately. It was the outcome of months of investigation, but seeing it materialize unsettled me. Ramon went on. Sergio had been arrested with forged documents and a list of cash payments. Marcos was under provisional arrest for assault and attempted fraud, and Isabel had disappeared. His words struck me forcefully. I imagined Muñoz, the arrogant lawyer, confronting the officers who stormed his office, watching the facade of respectability he had maintained for years collapse along with his schemes. I could see him, sweat running down his face, his eyes evasive, aware that there was no escape. Thinking of Marcos in custody affected me in a different way. Seeing my son reduced to a mere number in a legal file was one of the most painful images I could bear. Even so, I knew it was inevitable. The line between saving him and becoming his accomplice had been crossed long ago. Isabel's case was different. Her disappearance did not surprise me. I had always sensed in her a cold intelligence, a survival instinct that would stop at nothing. Ramon suspected she had fled to France, where she had family contacts, taking with her whatever little she could still control. To me, her escape was nothing more than the clearest acknowledgement of her guilt. Her name would remain as an echo of betrayal in our family's memory. In the days that followed, I was summoned to testify in court. I entered the room with measured calm, my head held high, my suit immaculate, and the composure of someone who knows the truth is on his side. For over an hour, I laid out the facts before the judge. Marcos's assault that September night, the attempts to have me declared incapacitated, the evidence Ramon had gathered, and finally, the trust that secured my inheritance. With each word, I felt myself shedding the weight I had carried for months. Sergio Muñoz was charged with document forgery, bribery, and criminal association. His scoot was swift. In a matter of days, he went from having his name displayed on prestigious plaques in central Granada to appearing in newspaper headlines as an example of corruption. His colleagues quickly distanced themselves from him, and his name became a symbol of the decline of a once respected profession. Marcos remained in pretrial detention, facing charges of assault, causing injury, and attempted fraud. I saw him only once during that time, in a chance encounter in the courthouse corridors. He approached me hesitantly, his face worn and his eyes red from sleepless nights. He tried to speak, but I did not allow it. I simply told him a sentence I had carried within me for months. "Son, blood is no excuse for what you've done. Let justice decide now." Then I walked away, leaving behind what remained of the one who had once been my eldest son. The strangest part of that period was that, as those responsible fell one by one, I felt no sense of victory. There was no satisfaction in seeing their fates sealed or in reading headlines that merely confirmed what we already knew. What I felt instead was a mixture of relief and sorrow. I had protected what was mine, but at the cost of losing a part of my own life. That contradiction stayed with me every day. Society, however, reacted quickly. Neighbors and acquaintances began to approach me with words of support, some even with admiration. "Don Antonio, what strength you have shown. Not everyone could have endured what you did." I would respond with a restrained smile, aware that behind those words there was also a sense of astonishment at how someone who appeared so vulnerable had managed to confront and overcome such a dark scheme. Clara became my quiet support. She took care of organizing my medical appointments, overseeing my treatments, and at the same time arranging meetings with the notary to ensure that everything we had signed remained secure. Her presence reminded me that loyalty still existed within the family, even if it came from only one side. As the months went by, I learned that Isabel had crossed the border to Leon, where she was staying at a cousin's house, trying to rebuild her life while carrying a legal stain that would follow her forever. I no longer needed to see or hear from her. To me, her name had been buried beneath the weight of betrayal. Looking back, I understood that the entire process had been like crossing a desert, with the hope of finding an oasis on the other side. Every step had been painful, and every moment of uncertainty threatened to bring me down. But in the end, I managed to get through it. Not unscathed, because the wound left by a child never fully heals, but stronger, convinced that dignity is not something to be bargained away. By the time the summer of 2022 arrived, justice was already progressing in most of the cases. As for me, I began to find peace in simple things: having breakfast with Clara, walking among the olive groves, reading during quiet afternoons. My life was no longer defined by the fear of betrayal, but by the certainty of having faced it. I came to understand that, although family fractures are the most painful, sometimes it is necessary to set boundaries and allow justice to act where affection has failed. That summer found me changed. I was no longer the man who had suffered in silence months earlier, nor the father who tried to excuse his son's actions in the name of love. I had become someone who had crossed the threshold of fear and learned to redefine what family means. Throughout that journey, Clara was a constant guide. Her presence became a relief after the storm. She accompanied my daily routines with a blend of care and firmness. In her, I saw not only a devoted daughter, but also a determined woman, shaped by the suffering she had witnessed in hospitals, and resolved not to allow her home to become another place of injustice. Thanks to her, I rediscovered the value of small moments: the smell of coffee at dawn, long walks among the olive trees, and the shared silence of quiet afternoons spent reading. The news that Marcos would remain in prison until the trial deeply shook me, not because I thought it was unfair, but because it confirmed that the young man who had once been a source of pride had become the architect of his own downfall. I accepted it as a loss, a son still alive, yet irretrievably lost in the consequences of his choices. Although I thought of him every night, I understood that I could not cling to false hopes. There are paths that, once taken, have no return. Only vague news reached us about Isabel. Through others, we learned that she was hiding in Leon, surviving on the help of acquaintances, burdened by debts and the shadow of an ongoing criminal case in Spain. I felt no urge to seek her out or to harbor further resentment. She had fled with the only thing she had left, her instinct for survival. To me, she had already become someone absent. With time, I realized that what I had gained was not only the protection of my assets, but the recovery of my inner peace. For too long, I had lived under emotional pressure, trying to maintain a fragile harmony at any cost. This experience taught me that unconditional love can become destructive when mistaken for permissiveness. Affection needs boundaries. Otherwise, it becomes the perfect tool for manipulation. Together with Clara, I decided to give new meaning to the future. Drawing from her experience in the medical field, she proposed creating a foundation to support elderly people who suffer abuse at the hands of their own families. Many arrived at hospitals beaten, stripped of their belongings, or emotionally broken, with nowhere to turn. The idea that my experience could be transformed into help for others gave me a sense of purpose beyond any desire for retribution. In September 2022, we formally established the foundation, which we named Living Dignity. Through it, we began allocating part of my real estate income to provide free legal and medical assistance to abused seniors. Watching that project come to life restored a sense of hope I thought I had lost. It was like planting a new olive tree, one I might not see fully grown, but one that would bear fruit for others. My granddaughter Inez, only 12 years old, became another reason to remain strong. Seeing her run through the courtyard, study at the living room table, I understood that there was still much to protect. Not only material possessions, but values. She would grow up knowing that her grandfather did not give up, that loyalty is not negotiable, and that no one should accept humiliation, even when it comes from those closest to us. Each afternoon, as I sat at my desk, now free of legal files, I felt that I had finally regained the right to enjoy my days. I stored away all the folders with evidence, recordings, and documents in the back of a drawer. That chapter had come to an end. I did not want my old age to become an endless chain of legal battles. What truly mattered had already been resolved. The betrayal had been exposed and brought into the light of justice. It comforted me to watch Clara, to see her smile return, no longer weighed down by the strain of the previous months. She too had carried an immense burden and, even so, emerged stronger, reinforcing a bond between father and daughter more valuable than any material inheritance. I came to understand that true wealth lay in that genuine connection, in that unconditional affection. Over time, I began to write my memoirs, not with the intention of publishing them, but as a form of release. As I revisited each moment, the night of the attack, the discovery of the scheme, Ramon's patience, the safeguarding of my assets, the confrontation with Marcos, the police searches, and the legal proceedings, I gradually closed old wounds. With every line I wrote, the weight I carried grew lighter, transforming pain into memory, rather than a present burden. Today, I know I cannot change what happened or recover what was lost with my son, but neither do I feel defeated. On the contrary, I have found a sense of peace rooted in knowing that I did what was right, even if the cost was high. Justice is not revenge. It is the restoration of balance. I have regained my dignity and protected what truly mattered. I no longer look to the future with fear, but with a clear sense of calm. I feel free from manipulation, free from toxic ties, free from guilt that was never mine to bear. The betrayal came from within my own home, but so did my strength. From Clara, from Inez, from the honorable memory of my wife, and from the conviction that it is never too late to stand up and set boundaries. That is the legacy I wish to leave. That dignity is not negotiable, not even in the face of blood ties. And that despite loss, there is always the possibility of rebuilding, of turning pain into a path toward freedom. If you enjoyed this story, you can support us by giving it a like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for being with us.